Okay, everyone, welcome to week 3 of APG 5091. This week, we are now turning our attention to humanitarianism, and the refugee crisis. So this has been an issue that has been highly topical in international relations, as well as Australian and international policy for many years. Um, Especially in Australia domestic politics, the issue of refugees and asylum seekers has never been very far from the minds of the major parties and their speeches and their policies, although these issues have arguably dissipated in the last few years. But over the last 20 years, asylum seekers and refugees crisis has played a major part in Australian domestic politics. Just try to press the slide. Here we go. So the learning objectives today is we're going to hopefully be able to understand the refugee crisis in Australia, as well as the domestic policy responses to this crisis. Then we'll move on to try to understand the post-2015 refugee crisis in Europe and have a look at how these are interlinked as well. And then finally, we're going to talk about applying critical IR theories to the refugee crisis. And this is something we'll probably pick up in a lot more detail in our workshops this week. And just to remind everyone, we've got 2 required readings this week, which are both very recent journal articles. It's important to have a look at these in some detail, not only for our book club that is coming up in our usual time slot this week, but also because you will be tested on these readings for the upcoming week 3 quiz. And I'll have a reminder about that at the end of this lecture as well. So we're going to begin our discussion with Australia's approach to refugee and asylum seekers. And before we get in too deep into this topic, I just want to give some broad definitional, I guess, statements about, what we're talking about so everyone's on the same page. And just as well, just to note for everyone else's benefit that I used to also work for a number of years as a volunteer lawyer at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre here in Melbourne. So some of the presentation here will be a little bit about my experiences in that role as well. But it's really important to understand the difference between asylum seekers and refugees. And asylum seekers are usually individuals who are seeking international protection, where refugees are those individuals who have already been recognized and granted asylum under the UN Refugee Convention of 1951. And to meet the elements of refugee, there's a few important kind of components that people need to meet to be able to recognize as such, which are usually, I think, about 5 or so. And the first one is a person has to be outside their place of origin. So they have to have obviously fled the country. The reason for their flight has to be one of persecution. And this fear of persecution must be well-founded as well. So the person must have either experienced it or, likely to experience if they return to their country of origin. And the persecution, the 4th element, has to result from the 5 grounds which are listed in the Refugee Convention. And this relates to race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So they have to have some kind of persecution along those 5 lines. And finally, they have to be unwilling or unable to seek protection in their own country as well. So these are the components that countries are obliged to assess people who are fleeing their countries for, to determine whether they are able to claim refugee status under the Refugee Convention. And this is also something that Australian governments have assessed in very different ways over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. And we'll talk a little bit more about exactly how they do that. Sorry, just a little pop-up from my antivirus. So yes, now we've just gone through, who are asylum seekers and who are refugees. Now, at present in Australia, and we'll step back and go through the history soon, but at present in Australia, there's kind of 2 distinct ways of becoming a refugee. And both these ways are through Australia's refugee and humanitarian program. And we'll again talk a little bit more about what that looks like soon and how many refugees are accepted within that program yearly. But the first one is an onshore protection program. So this is for people who arrive in Australia on a valid visa. So it might be like a student or a work visa or even a tourist visa, for instance, and then apply for asylum. So these people are already like onshore. So people in this category usually might wait up to 5 or more years on temporary bridging visas while their claims are processed. So there's usually quite a long wait with not a lot of social support. So it's usually a very difficult period for these people. And they don't have access to Centrelink. They might also usually have irregular access to Medicare and sometimes no work rights as well. So this is like the onshore way that people in Australia or who get to Australia can become refugees. The other manner of becoming a refugee is the offshore resettlement program. So this is where people have their refugee status decided overseas. So they might be in refugee camps elsewhere around the world, and are then resettled to Australia and granted permanent residency. Then they'll be able to access services like Centrelink and Medicare immediately after they arrive. But again, these processes do also take a significant amount of time. Obviously, I think many of you have had an idea about Australia's refugee policy over the last 20 or 30 years will have noticed that in these two categories, there's not a category for someone who arrives to Australia not on a valid visa. And in Australian, recent contemporary history, a lot of the way that people have tried to reach Australia is by boat, obviously, because we're an island. That's the least expensive way to get here, as well as other kind of drivers. People who try to reach Australia by boat have long been targeted by Australian asylum seeker and refugee policy in a very punitive way. And so we're going to focus a lot of our discussion on Australia's responses to people arriving by boat to try to claim refugee status. And even though Australia has differentiated how they treat those people, that is not something that is allowable in international law, because every single person who is seeking asylum or looking to be protected as a refugee has the equal right to do so. So, from the get-go, our categorization of refugees and asylum seekers as to whether they're arriving on a valid visa or an invalid visa, or by boat or by plane or whatever it may be, is seen as invalid under international law. So these are just some kind of starting points just to keep in mind. But now we're going to turn a little bit more to the actual history of Australia's relationship, I guess we can say, to asylum seekers. And early on, Australia's history was very much in terms of the migration and refugees, was very much characterized by the white Australia policy. So before World War II, especially, if people people who tried to come to Australia were generally unsuccessful unless they were from Western Europe. There was a test that was used by immigration officials to with people who were arriving from Western Europe, for example, which is called the dictum test. And so this was very much a test that was administered without any kind of clear rules exactly what they were looking for, but is more or less what we might think of as an English test. But the migration officers would usually, ask some incredibly difficult questions based on like Anglo-Saxon history, for example, towards people who are seen as coming from undesirable parts of Europe, or were from undesirable ethnicities or religious groups. So often people from southern Italy or Slavic countries and Jewish people were all kind of discriminated by this dictum test. Which is, usually they either ask some kind of very niche Anglo-Saxon history, which obviously, someone coming from an Anglo-Saxon country wouldn't have received, but they just, had these questions for people they didn't want to accept in the country. Or alternatively, they would also screen people based on their accents as well. So this kind of early relationship Australia had with refugees before World War II was dictated by the White Australia policy, and it was geared towards kind of allowing people from so-called desirable parts of Western Europe and from desirable backgrounds. So this dictum test was a central part of that initial discrimination. Now, the White Australia policy did formally end in 1973, and soon after that, the first arrival by boat of people came from Indochina. So that was obviously the time where the Vietnam War was raging, so a lot of people were fleeing the Vietnam War, and this was kind of what was called the first wave of refugees to Australian shores by boat. Now, Australia at that time accepted quite a large contingent of Vietnamese asylum seekers, and in the years following that time of 1973, and I think it would have definitely been after 1975, but Malcolm Fraser, particularly Australia's Prime Minister at that time, was praised as taking in a lot of Vietnamese asylum seekers at that point. And so then after that, the kind of next so-called wave of refugees coming by boat was in 1992, where people were fleeing Cambodia, and Cambodian refugees started to arrive by boat, but they started to become detained in Port Hedland, which is a town in northwestern Australia. And this was the start of what we would then finally start to understand as mandatory detention of so-called boat people. So, through this lecture, I will be referring to people who arrive by boat as boat people for short in some respects. And obviously this has, that term has certainly been seen as discriminatory and used in a pejorative sense. But I'm also going to be using it to describe how Australia views refugees and asylum seekers, which is very much as, boat people, for example. But in 1992, these Cambodian arrivals kind of began the response to that began the process of mandatory detention. And again, it's important to note that the Refugee Convention recognized that people who are in fear of their lives, who are fleeing their country of origin, may be forced to enter countries unlawfully. And so the Refugee Convention is very clear on prohibiting countries penalizing people who do this on account of their so-called illegal entry. So that's very much something that is understood as a distinct possibility by the Refugee Convention. And so a punitive reaction to those illegal arrivals has always been something that has not been allowable in international law. However, since 1994, Australia had started to enforce mandatory detention of refugees arriving illegally in Australia, and this has also included children, whether they're accompanied by parents or not. Now, the next kind of really important part of Australia's asylum seeker policy, obviously, during the 90s, there were discussions about asylum seekers and refugees. There were policy developments, but I think, the really significant next major milestone in Australian domestic responses to the ongoing and building refugee crisis was the Tampa affair. For those of you who were alive back then, you may have remembered this or have heard about it, because it was a very significant part of Australia's political history. So in 2001, about mid-2001, we were getting closer and closer to a federal election. And John Howard, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was increasingly unpopular. There was, a general sense that he was probably going to lose the next election. And John Howard was from the Liberal National Party. So this was kind of the political context. But then in September or so, there was a Norwegian container ship called the MV Tampa that was passing just north of Australia. And they received a distress call from a boat which was capsizing in the seas above Australia. And there were hundreds of people who were fleeing Afghanistan, who were mostly Hazaran people who were fleeing the Taliban in Afghanistan, and they were sinking. And so the MV Tampa and the captain of the MV Tampa decided to pick them up. And these refugees were able to get on board the Tampa, and this was around like 140 or so kilometers north of Christmas Island. So he had them on the boat, and the Tampa's captain at this stage then started to go towards the Indonesian city of Merak to deposit the refugees, which was the closest port with facilities to kind of berth such a large vessel as the MV Tampa. However, some of the rescued Hazarian refugees threatened to commit suicide if they were returned to Indonesia, because many of them had actually started their journey out from Indonesia, having made their way from Afghanistan down to Indonesia. And so, they didn't want to return back to the prevailing conditions in Indonesia. And then others actually entered the ship's bridge and told the captain that they wanted to be taken to Christmas Island, which is a part of the Australian continent. However, the Australian government was obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but at this stage and at all stages, very unhappy about this proposed course, and they refused to allow the Tampa to land any of the asylum seekers in Australian waters or Australian territory. Now, the ship still then continued towards Christmas Island and crossed the Australian maritime boundary. And this, I think, was in early September at some stage. And the Australian authorities advised the MV Tampa captain that he was in flagrant breach of the Australian domestic law. And then the government dispatched dozens of special forces, military personnel to intercept the ship, board it, and then prevent it from sailing any closer to Christmas Island. The Royal Navy then took the Tampa's asylum seekers to Nauru, from where about 130 or so of them were sent to New Zealand, and the remaining 300 or so were processed on Nauru over the coming months, although there were a few that remained for several years afterwards. So this was a really significant political crisis, which received a huge amount of political coverage. And as a response to the Tampa crisis, in the aftermath of this incident, the John Howard government passed a series of laws that created a kind of a new legislative framework for handling asylum seekers as they came to Australia's shore. And this was known as the Pacific Solution. So this included generally the excision of many of Australia's offshore islands, including Christmas Island, from Australia's migration zone. So this meant that previously the migration zone of Australia encompassed multiple islands around the Australian mainland, which meant that this is where the refugee convention would apply. This is where, if people were in, they could apply for refugee status. And when when they spoke about excising them, that means they took them away from the migration zone. So just basically made the migration zone narrower, closer to the mainland, so more difficult for people, especially arriving by boat, to submit and demand protected or refugee status. So this was kind of one of the first significant parts of the Pacific Solution. And the Pacific Solution also meant that asylum seekers could be processed offshore, so in places like Nauru and also eventually Papua New Guinea's Manus Island. So then, just like what happened on the Tampa affair, Australia could intercept boats at sea in domestic law, certainly not international law, but could intercept boats at domestic waters, and then take them to these designated other places such as Nauru, such as Manus Island, where refugees could then be processed. At the time, the Labor opposition didn't oppose these measures, and as a result of the Tampa affair, in combination at this time, or shortly after, 9/11 occurred. So there was a really heightened sense of insecurity in a lot of major Western countries, and a lot of fear of asylum seekers and arrivals from certain countries, and also a resurging fear of Islamic terrorism as well. So there was a sense of insecurity, which was displayed by a lot of Western capitals in response to asylum seekers, which are coming from predominantly Muslim countries. And this issue of security and insecurity and also Islamophobia was used quite significantly by the government at the time, the Howard government, and many subsequent Australian governments, to create fear in the electorate and drive their re-election. And so John Howard was very successful at that particular time at using the Tampa crisis in conjunction with the tragedy of 9/11 to create a lot of fear around boat arrivals and foreign arrivals in general from particular countries. And he was able to then win that subsequent election, which before then he was seen as most likely to be losing. And that was also at the time then John Howard had his famous speech where he said something along the lines of, we will decide who come to this country and in what manner they arrive. So this was the start of a new phase in Australia's asylum seeker policy, and one that would define the ongoing approach of Australia to asylum seekers. So I mentioned before that Nauru and Manus Island were picked as offshore detention centres where processing could occur. So these agreements with Nauru and Papua New Guinea were also quite interesting from I guess interesting is maybe not the right word to use, but interesting from a development and I guess also a diplomatic perspective from Australia's point of view, because in exchange for accepting these refugees who were trying to get to Australia, Australia then promised that they would help Nauru and Papua New Guinea with development. So they would provide development assistance, or i.e. money, in exchange for taking these refugees. And so this has been something that has been very controversial in Australia, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, the relationship between these countries. And some critical scholars have said this is kind of a reawakening of Australia's kind of imperialist tendencies in the region to outsource their international responsibilities in exchange for small amounts of money to much poorer countries. And so this is something that we'll talk a little bit more on in a couple of slides' time. Now, generally, this policy of putting Australia, like asylum seekers and refugees bound for Australia in other countries, has been really criticised by international organisations, by the UN, and has been a really big point of contention. And especially because Nauru and Papua New Guinea aren't or haven't ratified, or certainly at that point, haven't ratified the Refugee Convention. So they didn't have the same obligations that a country like Australia has or had to refugees. And so like the UNHCR had concluded that this policy had violated significantly multiple parts of the Refugee Convention. And Australia has always been targeted by these UN agencies and international organizations for continued breaches of the Refugee Convention, and especially since this specific solution. So we'll move on to the next slide now and go a little bit more into the further history of Australia and refugees and Australian domestic policy towards refugees. So eventually, Kevin Rudd became Australian Prime Minister and ousted John Howard, which I think was in 2007. Kevin 07, I think I remember, was the slogan of Kevin Rudd at the time. So the Labor Party won the federal election in 2007. And there was then some changes which started to occur under the Labor's, I guess, stewardship of federal migration and refugee policy. However, boat arrivals did continue to increase once Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister. And it was important in Kevin Rudd's election and the Labour Party's election is that he promised to end the Pacific Solution. And I think it was in 2008 or 2009 that the Pacific Solution was ended. So the offshore processing was stopped by the Labour government, but the boat arrivals continued and arguably increased. And famously or infamously, in 2009, there was a boat which is carrying a large number of asylum seekers from Sri Lanka, which were intercepted in high waters, and the Australian Navy attempted to take that boat to Indonesia, and Indonesian Navy didn't want that to happen, and so there was a standoff in high waters between Australia and Indonesia, which was very damaging to our relationships with that country at that time. And then in 2010, there was a boat crash on Christmas Island, which killed almost 50 people who were seeking asylum as well. And then finally in 2012, early 2012, there was a capsize off Christmas Island where more than 200 people fell into the water, with most of them drowning. So there's kind of an ongoing nature of tragedy and people seeking asylum. And at this point, Australia had abandoned the Pacific Solution and hadn't really established any kind of effective legislative framework to replace it or to deal with this crisis in a more humane way, or certainly one based under international law. Now, since that particular time, so from about 2010 onwards, there's then been subsequently about 4 phases, we might say, in Australia's refugee response. So because of these tragedies, because of the increasing pressure from the LNP opposition and others around the country, the Gillard government at that time, and I think in about 2012, reinstated the offshore processing. So this was the first phase, the kind of reactivation of the Pacific Solution under the Gillard Labor government. So this was, I think about mid-2012, and it was called the no advantage phase. So this was where asylum seekers arriving by boat between about mid-2012 to mid-2013, they were then sent offshore again. Formally, this policy applied to everyone who were attempting to arrive by boat, but in reality, out of the 24,000 or so people within that year who attempted to get to Australia to apply for refugee status, only really about a little over 1,000 of those people were actually transferred offshore, which most of them are being processed in Australia still. So there was that reactivation of the Pacific Solution and the offshore settlement programs, but it was much slower than it was under the LNP Howard government. So this was called a no advantage policy, which meant that anyone who was actually recognized as a refugee offshore would not be granted a protection visa until they had waited as long as if they had been subject to the resettlement timeframes applied by UNHCR elsewhere in the region, or basically how long it took someone who was in a refugee camp in another country to have their refugee status processed and accepted by Australia otherwise. So the idea was that, from the perspective of the Australian government, that if you tried to enter Australia by boat, you wouldn't have an advantage compared to those who are waiting in refugee camps elsewhere. So this policy was finally abandoned in mid-2013 after the 1,000 or so people who were sent offshore were progressively brought back to Australia and then forced to wait several years more before finally being permitted the process of applying for refugee status. So then around end 2013, the Gillard Gillard as Prime Minister, or how to say this, Julia Gillard, who was Prime Minister, got what we call in Australian parlance knifed by Kevin Rudd. So just before the next federal election, there was again a general feeling that Julia Gillard would not be able to win. And so Kevin Rudd returned, was able to dispose of Julia Gillard as leader. And then Kevin Rudd, very soon to the federal election, instituted the second phase of this policy, in an attempt to kind of meet or address the criticisms that the LNP opposition had of the Labor government's asylum seeker and migration policy. So again, it was seen that Labor wouldn't win. They felt they had to do something to address these security critiques. And so there was the reformation of the next phase of Australia's asylum seeker policy at this stage. And this was called the never settle phase. So this meant that asylum seekers who were arriving by boat after about mid-2013 continued to be subject to offshore processing. However, the previous no advantage policy was replaced by a new ban where refugees arriving by boat in this group were denied the opportunity ever to settle permanently in Australia. So people arriving by boat who tried to get to Australia would never be able to settle in the country. This was, again, mainly in response to challenges posed by the LNP opposition prior to the federal election. And Australia transferred approximately 4,500 or so people offshore between 2012 and 2014, almost half of whom had returned to Australia by 2021. So, even though that policy seemed very definitive, there were still people who were transferred back to the Australian mainland and had their refugee process put through. So this was the second phase, the never settle phase. Now, Kevin Rudd, as most of you probably know, lost that election, and then the Abbott government came to power at the end of 2013. And this was when the Australian government started the Operation Sovereign Borders. So this is the Abbott LNP coalition government. Within days of taking office, the government launched this Operation Sovereign Borders, which was a military-led border security operation described by the government as the government's response to stopping the flow of illegal boat arrivals to Australia. So this basically involved intercepting boats on the high sea by the Australian Navy and turning the boats back to the country of departure. And this was the primary mechanism for deterring irregular maritime arrivals. Offshore processing was still retained as part of what was described as a broad chain of measures to deter, to disrupt, to prevent the asylum seekers coming to Australia. So these offshore processing centres still remained a key part of Australia's policy. But there was also, in addition to that, the Australian Navy intercepting boats on the high sea and trying to return them either to the boat's country of origin or the asylum seekers' country of origin. And in the Refugee Convention, this is called non-refoulement, which is something that is very much illegal in the Refugee Convention, which basically means, the prohibition of returning people to the place that they're fleeing from. But it became a crucial part of Australian policy for Operation Sovereign Borders. Now, the policy apparatus of Australia's response to the ongoing refugee crisis then entered its fourth phase in 2014, which has continued more or less right up to and a little bit past the 2020 COVID pandemic. This was the phase which we might call the returning of asylum seekers. So no new asylum seekers arriving in Australia by boat had been sent offshore at this stage. Instead, Australia started to return asylum seekers to their places of departure, going to really extraordinary lengths to pursue maritime pushbacks, despite the availability of offshore processing. And even though offshore processing remained an official policy during this period, since 2014 to 2020, the government attempted to slowly close it down because they were receiving, increasingly crescendoing criticism for the prevailing humanitarian conditions in these camps, which were seen as generally awful. were run often by private companies with security, which was often violent towards refugees. Several refugees and asylum seekers died over the course of between 2013 to 2021. And so there was a lot of pressure on the Australian government to close these offshore processing centres. And again, many international organisations saw these camps as cruel, inhumane, and degrading. So as the years started to progress in this fourth phase of returning asylum seekers, where the kind of focus of Australian policy was either refoulement of returning the asylum seekers to the country of origin, or transferring very slowly some asylum seekers from offshore processing elsewhere. It was more and more obvious that offshore processing had totally failed, and the government started to slowly change its rhetoric. And they attempted to shift responsibility for these policy failures to Nauru and PNG, claiming that they, were sovereign countries, it's wholly a matter for those states. And more legal and social challenges over Australian policy continued. As refugees continue to die on Nauru and Manus Island with, gigantic protests against offshore detention in Australia. So over these years, the Australian government attempted to put more emphasis on, Nauru and PNG's sovereignty in managing these centres and trying to wash their hands of responsibility. So they were trying to, I guess, rather than expanding and filling these detention centres, was to try to slowly take away refugees and asylum seekers within them to wind them down. And there was also that attempt on the Australian mainland too. Now, by the time of about 2017 or so, Manus Island Detention Centre closed, which was a significant development. And this was because at the time, the situation in the Manus Island Centre risked really descending into all-out violence. And even though the LNP coalition had originally championed offshore processing and overseen an initial expansion of it at the in Operation Sovereign Borders with the Abbott government, by late 2017, the Home Affairs Minister at that time, which was Peter Dutton, who is now the leader of the LNP party in Australia, sought to justify the government's attempts to, kind of extricate itself from Nauru and PNG as cleaning up the mess that the Labor government had made. So there was a recognition by the LNP at this stage that it was, I guess, very bad politically for them to be associated with the violence that was occurring on these camps as they attempted to close some of them. Having said that, there are obviously still offshore processing centres at this stage. So the new Australian government, which came to power, or I think 2 years ago or last year or recently, they still retain a lot of these aspects of domestic asylum seeker and refugee policy, which has cost a huge amount of money over the years, has seen lots of violence and a lot of domestic instability and protests over these particular policies. The regime of refugee of policies has been shown multiple times to contravene human rights by numerous international bodies such as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and even the International Criminal Court has called this offshore regime cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. So we have to ask, like, has it been successful? Australia's refugee intake from like 1995 to 2022 or so has been fluctuating between 12,000 and 24,000 people between those two kind of formal pathways I spoke about at the start of this lecture. And it's usually between about 13 to 17,000 people typically. So Australia has not accepted a great amount of refugees or asylum seekers through its its so-called official processes. And so this refugee regime or domestic policy regime hasn't been successful in terms of abiding further by Australia's commitments under international law. It may be, I think the way that it may be seen as successful is that it has been used successfully as a major political issue in Australian domestic politics that both parties have utilized to, both major parties have utilized as a successful tool to pursue their own political aims domestically, which has obviously had a very dramatic human cost on the people seeking asylum. So in the workshops this week, we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about Australian asylum seeker and refugee policy since 2020, because there has been other significant developments, such as the policies of indefinite detention has formally ended as of November 2023. So there has been some updates in Australia's approach to refugees and asylum seekers, and we'll hopefully have our guest speaker touch a little bit more on them this week. So now we've spoken and gone through quite a bit of detail of Australia's response to refugees and asylum seekers, and we are now going to have a look at the refugee crisis in Europe and how that has manifested in the continent, especially since 2015, and what kind of impact Australia's refugee policies have had on Europe at this particular time. So we'll start our story in 2015, which was termed the European refugee crisis. And I mean, this description of this particular time period as a refugee crisis, it's probably a little bit of a misnomer to regard it as purely a refugee crisis. At this stage in 2015, it was a really multifaceted one. There was certainly a refugee migrant crisis of a asymmetric nature, where people were fleeing from several countries towards Europe, which produced far-reaching kind of economic and political contradictions, which caused a lot of instability in the European Union, which was already shaky at that time. Because you have to remember, in 2015, we had the global financial crisis and the further ramifications of the austerity and other economic policies on certain EU member groups, which had created a lot of friction and instability within the European Union. And even before this 2015 refugee crisis, the southern so-called periphery EU states, which bordered the Mediterranean, such as Italy and Greece, were most affected by refugees who were coming much before 2015. And these were also the same countries that were most affected by the global financial crisis and the stagnation and kind of austerity that persisted after the GFC. So Greece and Italy remained heavily burdened by general movements of refugees, and especially as the 2015 European refugee crisis started going, and especially after the so-called Balkan route from Greece to Germany was cut off as this crisis really started to kick off. So most of the refugees who were fleeing at this time were coming from Syria and Afghanistan. So the Syrian crisis was a particularly strong driver of refugee flows towards Europe. And even globally, 1 in 5 refugees were Syrian at this time. This was obviously because of the Syrian civil war, which had grown since the Arab Spring and descended into huge amounts of bloody violence. And so millions of Syrians fled the war, with many being hosted in surrounding countries around Syria, but then many also looking to go to other places and seek asylum and refugee status. And this movement of Syrian people also augmented the other, high number of millions of, Libyans, Sudanese, Somalis, Iraqi people, Afghans, and Yemenis who were also fleeing conflicts in their own country. And one of the, a lot of the literature has said that one of the kind of most significant aspects driving the refugee crisis at that stage was this real sense of hopelessness that had prevailed amongst Syrians. So a lot of Syrians who are either in Syria or the surrounding countries, there'd already been 4 years of war at this stage, and there didn't seem to be any kind of diplomatic or political solution to the crisis. And so the future in Syria for them looked very, very bleak. And this reality had also set in amongst Syrians who are living in neighboring countries, and especially in neighboring countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, for example, where they were often ostracized, didn't have access to government services or any services whatsoever. This feeling of hopelessness had really set in a strong way. And a country like Lebanon, which is a small country with a population of less than 5 million, they had over 1 million Syrian refugees, whereas Jordan, again, a small population of less than 7 million or so, had over 600,000 Syrian refugees. So there was like a huge number of Syrians in these adjacent countries experiencing a large, ongoing political, economic crisis, and this distinct feeling of hopelessness, which then helped to drive their movement to other countries. And the problem with Europe at this stage, as large numbers of people started to move towards the European Union, is that the process or the policy framework that Europe had at this stage was totally chaotic. And Europeans, saw these large numbers of people and foreign people marching through Europe as a threat to their kind of established way of living, and a lot of populist movements started to exploit those fears, such as the far right movement in Germany, and especially the various political parties in the UK, and started to exploit this fear, which created divisions amongst the EU member states. So for these groups that were preying on these fears and were, pointing to this large movement of foreign people towards Europe as a grave security risk, these kind of anti-immigration feelings also went hand in hand with the rejection of the EU establishment, which was blamed for this loss of control on the borders. And from about mid-2015 to end 2017, there was about 1.4 million people, for example, who arrived in Germany alone as the country started to open up its borders to refugees that were stuck in Hungary. And so we started to see this real differentiation between some countries which are attempting to keep refugees out, and then other countries of the EU, such as Germany, who are opening their doors, which are then criticized by other members of the EU as further driving refugee flows. So there started to be this disintegration of the integrity and political unity of the European Union. And this was especially aggravated as the German Chancellor at the time, Angela Merkel, said at the end of 2015 that there was no limit to how many people or refugees that Germany could accept. And she had a very famous or infamous phase where she said, we can handle this. And by doing so, Germany basically suspended the conventions which had governed the entire response to refugees by the EU, which had persisted into this time, which basically said that the country or the country of the EU where refugees first arrived would be the country responsible for processing them, where Germany said, we'll accept any refugees that make it to Germany. And because obviously Germany, by its geographical location, is usually not one of the first places that refugees would enter, this then sparked a movement across borders of European countries of huge numbers of people towards Germany. So this was, again, something that was experienced as a significant internal political crisis. And weaken the integrity of the EU, and especially as Germany seemed to make this decision unilaterally and kind of redrew EU immigration policy, and was critiqued severely for this. But also, on the other hand, it was seen as a positive, I guess, a positive move in terms of the spirit of the Refugee Convention of welcoming refugees and making them feel safe. But because it was done in an uncoordinated and unilateral fashion, it certainly rocked the politics of the European Union, which is becoming more and more divided around this. So from about mid-2015 or so, to start to kind of deal with this crisis, there were hotspots around Greece and Italy, which were established where refugees and asylum seekers could have their claims assessed and then be either relocated within Europe if they were successful or repatriated. And then later that year in 2015, there's a scheme that was finally agreed to relocate 120,000 refugees from Greece and Italy to other EU countries, which again was another factor which caused a lot of heated debate, animosity, and anger, as there's obviously EU countries that didn't want to accept the refugees coming from Greece and Italy. And then finally, Germany started to backtrack on their open door policy by 2016 as well, as it became more domestically unpopular in Germany with their open door policy. And then also Sweden was another country which initially had quite a liberal policy towards refugees and asylum seekers, also started to backtrack on their previous liberal policies, again, due to domestic backlash. So with these dynamics of more and more people going to Southern Europe, and then after a year or so, the previously more liberal welcoming states started to backtrack on these promises, then more and more people became stuck in Greece or Italy. So the EU finally, near mid to end 2016, agreed a deal with Turkey to stem the inflow. So Turkey started to police the borders more and ensure refugees didn't go past their borders towards the rest of Europe. And this was also, seen as, well, at the time at least, it was seen as a political tool by Erdogan, the Turkish president, to elicit pressure over the European Union for political and financial support if Turkey would stem the flow of refugees. So there was also inter-EU politics which defined a lot of the European Union's response to the refugee crisis at this particular time. Now, since that time and the disintegration of European politics, especially between 2015 and 2017, which not only saw the rise of far-right parties across the continent, also resulted in the famous 2016 Brexit as well, with the European refugee crisis playing a huge part in the outcome of that vote. We've now kind of reached a stage in the last few years where the EU has declared that the EU is a fortress. So this is Fortress Europe. So now the European Union as a bloc has nearly 20 external steel walls or razor wire fences, which run to a combined length of about 2,000 kilometers. And this is compared to, 20 years ago when there was no walls around the EU. And since the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, having no borders in the European Union or around the European Union was seen as a really important, liberal political stance to demonstrate how open Europe was, especially after it was divided by the Cold War. But now there's many borders which separate Europe from the outside world, and also, borders and other processes to protect or to provide security, I guess, for countries within the EU and between themselves as well. And as of 2023, EU leaders have agreed to even, tougher border make border controls even tougher to try to keep out people who are still trying to seek asylum, because the asylum seeker and refugee crisis, although it may have abated slightly, is still something that is an incredibly important point in terms of world politics, but has certainly been impacting European politics since that time as well. So there's been more money pledged for fences, for cameras, for security, for drones, for watchtowers at the European Union's external borders. So even though the asylum seeker and refugee crisis has somewhat slipped away from the political limelight, in November last year, there'd still been about 100,000 people who claimed asylum in the EU in that year, which is the highest since 2016. So this has also caused a harsh response from the EU, this greater investment into more security, and also has had an impact on UK political developments, which we'll touch on in just a moment. Now, interestingly enough, I think many of you may also see some contradictions in this response, because obviously the response of Europe at this time between 2015 to 2017 to this large flow of refugees, predominantly from like Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan, and other countries in Africa and the Middle East, has been very punitive, very harsh. But if we have a look, for instance, at the approach of the European Union to refugees and asylum seekers who have fled Ukraine since the war in Ukraine began, we can see a really different response. The European Union mobilized its member states to accept Ukrainian refugees who were resettled across the European Union, where money was provided to ensure that they could settle comfortably. There were programs to assist their integration into society, and there was a lot of regulation around Ukrainian refugees, and firstly, permission for them to enter into the European Union. And there's been over 4.8 million Ukrainian refugees, many of them women and children, and they've been accepted under Europe's temporary protection schemes or other national programs. So, that the response towards Ukrainian refugees has obviously been very different to the response the European Union gave between 2015 to 2017 to refugees coming from countries around the Middle East and North Africa, which demonstrates that the bloc can very much work together to solve a refugee problem and do it relatively well. There's obviously there are a lot of problems around Ukrainian refugees who have fled into Europe in terms of the discrimination and violence and exploitation that they can face. But the actual policy response from the bloc was much more effective, pragmatic, and humanitarian towards the Ukrainian refugee crisis, much more differently compared to the 2015-2017 refugee crisis involving people from Middle East and North Africa. So again, this is something I want you to reflect on, think about the politics involved around this, because it is on the face of it, a bewildering contradiction. But again, if we think about in a critical way, like why the European Union would act differently to different groups of refugees, I think it gives us more of a greater insight, which I'll let you all reflect on in your own time. Now, finally, we'll go to the United Kingdom, because this is also an interesting, and especially since Brexit, an interesting example of the response to the ongoing refugee crisis in Europe, which has really mirrored a lot of the Australian domestic responses. And geographically, there's some small similarities between the United Kingdom and Australia, and that mostly we're both islands. And so there has been some policy transfer based on that geography, but probably more closely related to very similar politics. And as of 2023, the United Kingdom has really adopted most of Australian policy in terms of offshore detention and returning boats. in 2023, and this the picture and this background of Sunak is from this point in time. There was an announcement by the United Kingdom government that they were going to stop the boats, which is very, very similar language to the Tony Abbott era of Australian policy. And interestingly enough, after Tony Abbott was disposed from the Prime Ministership of Australia, he actually went to the UK several times to talk about domestic policy responses to refugees, and shared the Australian response. And so there was a lot of, I guess, push from conservative media and political figures in the United Kingdom to try to mirror Australian policy over that time. And finally, at the start of 2023, there finally was this policy suite which was passed, which saw asylum seekers who arrived in the UK deemed as illegal and prohibited from applying for protection under the refugee system. So again, very similar to Australia, these people were cast as illegal migrants. Any claim for protection is deemed inadmissible from these people. So anyone arriving illegally can't apply for protection, and they'll be removed to their home country or a so-called safe third country. And this particular set of laws also granted enhanced detention powers to the government, while kind of removal arrangements are underway. So in other words, it basically takes directly from Australia the approach of the Australian government to punitive refugee policy, including both the mandatory detention and the removal of people to other countries. And at this stage, I'm pretty sure it was just one country at this stage that accepted this as a third country to accept refugees going to the UK was Rwanda. So Rwanda was the only country so far, to my knowledge, who had accepted or has intimated they will accept refugees which are coming from which are trying to make it to United Kingdom. So acting kind of like the Australian Nauru or PNG. So again, these policies and laws were introduced under this stop the boat rhetoric, echoing that Tony Abbott era language. And public statements around the United Kingdom government has focused on the argument that people who pass through safe countries on the way to the UK should be removed without having their asylum claims or heard, in order to deter others from coming here. So there's that deterrent measure, which again was a very strong normative dimension of Australia's asylum seeker policy, and still is. Often, for the United Kingdom, they can't actually remove people to their countries of origin, because it's usually, might be too far away. And so that's why they're also using that third country to remove asylum seekers who are trying to get to UK shores. Now, interestingly enough, the agreement with Rwanda to accept asylum seekers was actually ruled unlawful in late 2023 by the UK Supreme Court. So there's a lot of issues with the implementation of the policy of the United Kingdom government in terms of asylum seekers and refugees. But I think what is interesting for us here in terms of learning about the Australian domestic policy apparatus towards refugees and asylum seekers is that even though it was really strongly critiqued by all manners of international and domestic organizations, human rights groups, whoever it might be, there has been policy transfer, especially to the United Kingdom, quite recently. And so this is something that I think will be very interesting to watch develop over the next few years, and especially based on who comes out on top of the next UK elections too, which I believe are reasonably soon. So yes, we'll have to, I guess, monitor this space and see how they develop. And we will, in this week, be talking a little bit more about Australia's own policy apparatus more recently. So again, in this lecture, I tried to give a little bit of an overview of the stages of Australia's refugee and asylum seeker policy responses from about the early 1990s over to 2020. And so I haven't gone too much more after the COVID crisis. This week we'll have one of the lead policy officers, who's also a lawyer, from the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, come and talk to us. And she will mostly be focusing on that post-2020 approach of Australian governments and successive Australian governments to the refugee and asylum seeker crisis. Now, also in this week's workshops, we'll be doing a stakeholder analysis for the refugee asylum seeker policies, while deploying our theoretical lenses that we've been focusing on so far in this semester. So this will be the kind of central part of our activity in workshops this week. We'll also have our regular Kahoot. We'll have our book club, and we'll also have our guest lecturer coming in as well. Importantly, too, please remember the quiz from week 2. It seems like most of you have done it and have been doing really well. So please remember to continue doing this, and I'll give you some more reminders of this in workshops, and also help you as well when we do our book club to dive into the depths of these readings to then help you with your quizzes. So thank you everyone for tuning in. This is the week 3 lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in our workshops this week. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.